Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Brandis, and I'm with the Colorado Small Business Development Center Network's SBDC Tech Source program. I'd like to welcome you all today to the webinar, Calculating Indirect Rates for Government Contracts and Grants. We're glad you could join us, and we hope that you'll receive some great takeaways today. Very quickly, I'd like to introduce you to our Colorado SBDC Tech Source program, designed to support science and technology ventures throughout the state of Colorado. Different from many accelerators and incubators that lead to equity funding, where you give away an ownership piece of your company, SBDC TechSource focuses especially on sources of non-dilutive capital where there's no equity given, and on technology commercialization and SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research grants. Colorado SBDC TechSource is a specially designed program that taps subject matter experts such as Brian Ormsby today to provide you, the science and technology entrepreneurs and companies, from pre-startup through advanced second stage with direct assistance. That comes in the form of customized expert consulting at no cost to you and through relevant workshops and events in person and online throughout the year. Topics include SBIR, STTR, and advanced industry grant proposals and compliance, technology commercialization, IP protection and assistance with the patent process, market research, market sizing, strategic and tactical planning, access to capital, and much more. A few quick things. After this webinar, if you're interested in meeting one-on-one with an SBDC TechSource specialist or attending events, workshops, or webinars, please visit our website, sbdc-techsource.org, to get started. Today's webinar will be recorded, and you will receive an email following the presentation with a link to the recording, allowing you to go back and view this webinar as often as you'd like. You will also receive a copy of today's presentation slides. This year's Innovation and Opportunity Conference, Advancing Aerospace and Defense, also known as IOC, will take place on November 14th and 15th in Aurora. This conference brings together NASA and other government agency experts, small businesses, startups, research institutions, and large businesses or prime contractors for a technology and commercialization event. The IOC provides opportunities for companies at every stage of maturity, from those just starting out with a great idea to experienced innovators looking to expand and actively participate in tomorrow's aerospace and defense. We hope you can join us for that event. We are going to include all of this information in the follow-up email. I'd now like to introduce today's webinar presenter, Brian Ormsby. Brian will be sharing with us for a little under 1 hour today, and then we will have time at the end to answer any questions you may have. Feel free to type out your questions during the webinar in the chat space. He will answer them at the end as long as time allows and follow up on any questions that may not be answered today. Brian is founder and CEO of Pantheon Solutions, LLC. He's passionate about helping small businesses succeed in the difficult terrain that is government-compliant accounting and contract management. Brian's a U.S. Air Force veteran serving in cost and budget analysis. Brian also spent 10 years as the Director of Operations and Program Manager with Pathfinder Systems, Inc., building simulators for the U.S. Department of Defense and NATO allies. Brian has extensive experience in cost and pricing. During his tenure at Pathfinder, Brian was responsible for all cost volume submission for the company's proposals to the DoD and NATO allies, which included several per year. Brian currently specializes in helping firms manage their accounting and contracts with the DoD, NSF, NIH, DOE, and NASA. Brian is a certified ISO 9001 quality auditor, as well as a DOT certified cost analyst. He holds a BS in management from Regents College. Thank you for joining us, Brian.
Oh, thanks for having me. So, yeah, I look forward to this topic. There's a lot of information in this subject matter, so we'll try to get through as much as we can, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some questions. So, calculating indirect rates is actually a pretty deep subject, and so we'll talk about the basics and then try to dig in a little bit. But in just an hour, it's not going to be possible to cover everything. So in the presentation, have left a lot of links to help you as you go forward. So, let me get where I can flip slides here. There we go. Okay, so topics of discussions today. We're going to initially talk about the chart of accounts, because if your chart of accounts isn't set up right, then calculating indirect rates is almost impossible. We're going to talk about cost elements that go into each contract or grant or cost proposal. We'll talk about rate structures and some of the different things in there about how you determine what your rate structure should be. And then we'll get into how to calculate rates. And I've got some examples in here, the National Science Foundation standard for calculating rates, and then a Fringe in facilities, a Fringe in F&A standard, and then a Fringe overhead and G&A standard. And then hopefully we'll finish about 10 minutes before the hour and wrap up with questions. So chart of accounts is, pretty critical to making sure that your indirect rate system has the structure so that you're able to put everything together. So there's some key elements in compliant accounting. One is a numbering system so that you can, kind of guide yourself back to where you are. Now, in GAAP-based compliance, there's some standard numbering systems, and typically we're going to talk about the numbering system from 500 or 5,000 or 50,000, depending on how your structure is, on. So typically the 5s are your direct or cost of goods sold area, and then you move into 6s, and then from here you can number kind of as you see fit. So you can do, say, 6-0 for Fringe, and 6-1 for facilities, and 6-2 for overhead. And then if you administrative, if you want to, you could make it 6-3, or you could make it 7. So the numbering system does have a lot of flexibility, but it's important that you put things in these pools so that we can get back to an indirect rate. Now, we may not use all of these pools when we're calculating our rate, but the government actually requires, this is kind of the minimum set of pools that is required for government compliance. So at some point, and it depends on the agency, some agencies have restrictions on independent research and development. Some agencies have some restrictions on bid and proposal. So you have to be able to sequester those costs so that if you're dealing with one of those agencies, you can comply with their rules. So this next slide just talks about the elements of costs in a contract or a proposal, and this is pretty standard stuff. But when you're writing a proposal for a grant or a contract, you're going to need to know what your direct labor is, what your direct consultants are, what your subawards on that contract are going to be, what kind of materials are you going to be using, raw materials, office supplies that are going to be direct necessities, your direct travel, any equipment that you might buy. Typically, the definition of equipment is larger items of purchase of $5,000 or more. And then the last two are indirect expenses and profit. So depending on the type of grant or contract, profit has some limitations. And you can look that up, but there's some relative standards. If you're in a cost type contract, you're probably going to get 6, 7, or 8% profit. On a fixed price contract, profit generally isn't reported. So profit is kind of the number that you're going to get once you deliver and what your costs are and the difference. So you need to calculate that in to make sure that you're going to get some. But indirect expenses is a very large portion of a contract, and sometimes depending on the makeup of your organization, could be much greater than all of these other items combined. So that's why calculating indirect rates is so important. And so let's move into a little bit about rate structures and talk about, what kind of rate structure your company is going to use and why. So first off, we talked about some of the basics of a rate structure. We need to talk about what rate structure makes sense for you and your organization. And so what type of contract vehicle are you going after, and what agency are you going to be applying to? Some agencies, if they're your one and only agency, you may be kind of constrained with using a rate structure that they prescribe. You also want to look at what are your corporate requirements and what your corporate desirements are. So in terms of how do you like to track and see things in your indirect rate structure. And I like audit response. And audit response is, depending on what agency you're working with, what are they used to? And does it make sense to use a rate that will make the whole audit process a more simpler thing, where you don't have to explain to your auditor your rate structure, give them a rate structure that they're used to seeing. Like everyone else, your auditors have limited exposure. So if they're an auditor that is, specifically in the National Science Foundation world or National Institutes for Health or Department of Defense, they're going to get used to probably a limited selection of rate structures. So if you throw them a curveball, it could make the entire auditing process a little bit more difficult. So the importance of a rate structure and what rate structure you pick really comes down to two things. Am I covering all my costs? And am I billing my contracts correctly? So it shouldn't make a difference. Regardless of what rate structure you choose, you should be able to meet these two objectives. So you want to make sure that when you pick a rate structure, that these two objectives are forefront for you, because you need to be able to calculate back to make sure that these two questions are being answered correctly. Are you covering all your costs is important to your business? Am I billing my contracts correctly is all the government is concerned about. So they don't care if you're covering your costs. If you're losing money, they're generally not going to complain. So let's talk about some contract types, and then we'll talk a little bit about some agencies and kind of some of the things that you see with these agencies. So you got different contract types, and the four main ones are listed here. They're, depending on whether you're in construction or IT or things like that, there are some twists and turns in here, but a grant generally is money that is given to you with some expectation of some level of effort that you've pushed forth in your proposal, but there's no promise in a grant that you'll deliver a particular item on a particular day, like you would with a fixed price, which is generally, a fixed price will say that, 3 months after contract award, we expect you to deliver this widget, and at that time, we'll accept that widget and we'll pay you this amount of money. And that's more structured with a fixed price contract. So, grants are generally, and I say generally because there's strings attached to grants that sometimes you wouldn't think would be there, but grants are generally an award of money for research primarily in an area that may or may not be fruitful. So whether your research pans out or not, you should still get your money. Cost plus fixed fee is what we call best effort. So when you win a cost plus fixed fee award, it is your job to do the best you can to fulfill what you said or thought you were going to do when you wrote your proposal and what the government's expectation is. But if you don't, you're going to continue to strive to do research as long as you can. And at the end, the fixed fee, which is the fee that was in the original proposal, will be paid to you, and they will cover your costs up to whatever the cost ceiling is. So if you spend more than that, they're not going to cover it. They won't add fee to that. If you spend less than that, technically you should still get the fee, but spending less money on a cost plus fixed fee is in large amounts is fairly rare. And then time and materials is a little bit different entirely. So if you've never dealt with the time and materials, what you do is you take your labor base. So let's say we have a person that's making $30 an hour that's going to provide a service to the government. And then we add fringe and other indirect costs onto that and profit, and we build up a rate, and we say, hey, that $30 an hour plus all of our indirect costs is going to cost you $70 an hour. So when we work for you, we're going to bill you $70 an hour. And time and materials is generally more like consulting, where they're asking you to perform certain functions and you're billing them by the hour. They always have some ceiling where you won't go beyond this particular number. But the importance of all of these contract types is in no circumstance here is there an opportunity for you not to know what your indirect rate is and then still know whether you're making money. So it's very important for a business acumen for you to know what your indirect rates are, even if the government doesn't ask. So let's talk a little bit about some agencies and the differences between these agencies and what some of their expectations are, and maybe how that influences your choosing a rate structure. First thing I'll say about agencies is all agencies are very similar in the fact that if you're dealing with another agency and you already have a rate structure that has been audited or approved in their system, that the expectation is that you would continue with your approved or audited rate structure. So if you're an active player with the National Institutes of Health and you have incurred cost proposals with them, and then you get a DOE grant or a DOD grant, it's very accepted and expected that you will take the incurred cost audit rates from the agency, in this case National Institutes for Health, and apply that to the other agencies. Because in the end, if rates are right, and it covers your indirect costs. So if you're an NIH, which typically uses a fringe and F&A structure, and then you win a DoD contract, they're going to be perfectly happy with the fringe and F&A structure because NIH has already validated that rate structure is working. Likewise, if you're with DoD and you're using, fringe, overhead, and G&A, or maybe in a more complex structure where you have, 2 or 3 fringe rates based on, on-site facilities and off-site facilities. There's a lots of different things that can go into rate structure. And I'm going to talk about the basics here, but just wanted to talk briefly about super complex rate structures. And if you're using one of those with like a DoD component, and then you win an NIH grant, they're going to use what is already approved from another agency, and they'll accept it. So you don't have to go through this process of trying to figure out multiple rate structures from multiple agencies. And in fact, it's unhealthy for your organization to even consider it, because once you start with apples and oranges, there's really no way to get back to what is correct unless you hire a couple of mathematicians on your staff to take care of it. So whatever agency you're dealing with, it's always a good idea to find out what rate structure they're used to, what rate structures are acceptable within their incurred cost proposal. And I'm saying this is if this is the first organization you deal with. So when we get into some later slides, I'll show you some links to, indirect rates, incurred cost proposals, and so on and so forth with NSF, NIH, and DoD, where you can look at how their rates are calculated, and that'll help you select a structure that makes sense for you. So let's go on to the next slide. So now we talk a little bit about corporate requirements, and so all this rolls together. All of it is important because in the end, the FAR only has a requirement for a rate structure, a single rate. FAR refers to it as G&A, but if you're a one rate structure, you could call it indirect, you could call it over, you could call it anything because it's just one rate. And in the commercial world, they generally do one rate structures and they call it overhead. So if your corporate level of granularity is that you want to have one rate and you're going to compare your indirect costs as a ratio to your direct costs, and that's your one rate structure, that is a decision that you may decide you want to make. You also have decisions, where I alluded to in the last slide, we talk about overly complex rates. And I'm not saying overly, incorrectly overly complex, but some people need to have multiple fringe rates, multiple overhead rates. Some people need to have a subcontractor management rate because in some, and what normally happens is if you have lots of contracts and some are subcontractor heavy and some have zero subcontracts, then it doesn't make sense, possibly doesn't make sense for your contracts that have no subcontracts at all to be burdened somehow with subcontractors. So you could create a subcontract management rate that then only applies to contracts that have subs. Some people will exclude subcontractors from the rate entirely so that they're not rated and G&A is not tacked on. So there's lots of things to consider when you're looking at a rate structure. The other thing to consider is, what does your contract say? And you have to be very careful because contracts are getting more creative in the last decade, where there are by contract things that are expressly excluded from your rate structure. So let's say you have a contract that says that subcontractors are going to be excluded from your rate structure, then that should bring the decision to your management team is, are you going to exclude them on this one contract because it is that way, or do we want to do that across the board from now on? So there's lots of different things to consider in rate structures. And saying that, every incurred cost audit or proposal on every agency has the same caveat, is that if you have corporate decisions that change your rates, that's okay. They just need to know about it. So if you're using a rate structure in 2018 that you're not happy with, you don't necessarily have to be stuck with it. You can say, hey, in 2019, we would like to change to this, and here's why. And you need to spell that out when you put your proposal to them for rates, but there's no reason you can't do those things. So here in your audit response, and I alluded to this a little bit, I'm not going to spend very much time on this side because I like to get into calculations, but your agencies are going to be used to seeing different kinds of things. And DCAA, the most common rate structure in the DCAA they see is fringe overhead G&A. NIH is a fringe F&A structure. NSF is a one rate with base labor or a modified base labor being their base for that rate. So, you may consider that when you're putting and deciding what rate structure to use, because if I know I'm going to get audited from the DCAA, maybe I want to use a rate structure that they're used to seeing so that when the auditor comes to town, things will just go smoother. But you don't have to, because what they can require is one rate, G&A, or you can call it anything you want, but you have to have an indirect rate of some kind, and it can be one rate if you choose. Okay, so let's talk about calculations, and we'll spend the rest of the time trying to go through this the best I can in the short amount of time. And so going back to, kind of rounding things up from what we talked about from the beginning here, is we have to segregate costs into pools in your accounting system. Then we have to determine what rate structure we're going to use, and then we can combine pools to create, typically let's talk about a fringe F&A or fringe overhead and G&A rate structure. And this the fringe pool would be the fringe rate, and then you would create a base for that, and you would calculate a percentage. Overhead generally is facilities and then overhead or engineering support. So you combine those two pools into overhead. And then G&A is everything else, which would be your administrative cost, your marketing, your bid and proposal, and your IRAD. So in that structure, you would have 7 pools that would be combined in different ways to create 3 rates. If you were in a fringe and F&A, fringe would stand alone, and then everything else would be added into, the other 6 pools would be added into an F&A pool. So determining the bases for each category depends on how you select your structure. So if you're using a particular pool, then how you determine what the base is defined in the far as costs that have a causal relationship to the pool. So fringe applies to labor. So your base would be all productive labor. And so when I say productive labor, I'm not including PTO because that's a fringe. I'm not including vacation because that's a fringe. So only time when people are on the clock charging to a pool or a contract would be productive labor. And that becomes your base. You divide the total fringe pool against your base, you get a fringe rate. It's pretty simple. So once you've calculated with each one of these pools what the base is, what's the causal relationship, I've come up with a rate. Now we have to make sure our rate's correct. So if we take those rates and we work them back into the total of our contract costs, we should be able to equal back to the total of the pools to make sure all the costs were calculated. So we run this. This is how we calculate rates. Then we run the rates back, just like you did when you were in math in grade school, in middle school, in high school. There's a check for everything, right? So let's talk about a particular rate structure, and we'll go into this a little bit. And this slide is a brief of what we're going to see on the next slide. But so NSF being a one rate based on direct labor, or NSF modified direct labor, and I'll show you what I mean on the next slide. is we take a total allowable indirect costs. Now, NSF has some rules about what's allowable and what's not, so you need to read on that. And if I go into that, we'll be on this slide for the rest of the time. So we'll just talk about the total allowable indirect costs. We're going to divide it by the NSF calculated direct labor, and then we're going to come up with a rate. Now, NSF has some other rules about the maximum amount of rate. So 150% as far as they will allow you to go if you do an incurred cost proposal. 50% is as far as they will allow you to go if you do not do an incurred cost proposal. So that is what they call an unjustified rate. Now, NSF is interesting because if this were your rate and you did an incurred cost proposal and it was accepted, you would win a contract, and this would be the rate that was on that contract. If your rate turned out to be 118, this is all they're going to pay you is 114.36. If your rate turns out to be 110, they're going to ask for the 4.36 back, or for you to spend direct costs to make up for it. So they're kind of a one-way street, but you know, that's the NSF, and dealing with them is its own world. So you know, just make sure that when you're dealing with an agency, you understand their particular rules. I have two links here that help you with the rules, but the NSF guidance is actually really good. You know, if you go to their website, sometimes it takes a little while to find it, but if you can't find it, you can send off a little contact to them and say, hey, I'm looking for the answer to this question, and they're very good about getting back with you and getting you answers. So let's look at the calculations of how we get to this 114.36. So I created a dummy profit and loss statement, and then I just kind of transferred costs in here basically by pool totals. So in this case, we had $500,000 of total direct labor, and then we had $48,000 of IRAD. And then if you go over to the right-hand side, you're going to see that we had $364,808 of engineering and direct, and then we had $67,066 of administrative, $50,000 in bid and proposal, and then about $9,500 in marketing and sales. So this calculation on the right is a requirement to come up to what they call an NSF limitation, or excess indirect labor to be reclassified. So in this case, we take the direct labor, independent labor, and we come up with a direct labor pool. 35% of that is the limitation. So since we have 491,000, we subtract out the 192 from that, and we come up with $299,000 that's excess of this NSF limitation, and we have to push that over to direct labor. And what it does is it increases the base. So, you know, this is kind of the crazy quirk of National Science Foundation. Most small companies that are dealing with NSF are startups. They're, you know, the typical is a professor that broke away from the university because they got a really cool idea and they take it to the NSF. So generally they don't have a reclass of indirect labor because they don't have a lot of indirects. But if you did, this is how it would happen, and it would give you a modified direct labor rate based on how the NSF calculates it. So then the other part is we take all of our indirect amounts and we add all those together, and so you're going to find that my model here shows that we have, you know, 969,800 basically of allowable indirect, and we divide those two apart from each other, and we get 114.36. So there's the math. If you go to the link, you will get a really good guide. Basically, how they do it in National Science Foundation is they have you basically enter your profit and loss statement, and then they have a series of columns that go out to the right-hand side, and you categorize everything from your profit and loss into those series of columns, and then it falls into the pools. So they basically tell you how to pool it. So if you had a very simple P&L because you weren't dealing or used to dealing with the government, it creates the pools for you and then shows you how to draw them down into the calculations. So it's kind of nice and it's easy to follow. So if you get a contract with the NSF, go to those links and follow their guides, and you'll probably be just fine. So let's talk about Fringe and facilities, and then I've got some links here to NIH. Fringe and facilities is kind of their model. So it's very easy. Again, in these links, they have the same process because they're used to having lots of companies who aren't dealing with the government come to them. So you put your profit and loss on the left-hand side, and it's got columns over to the right to create the pools, and then it helps you calculate those pools. And so you can see here kind of the summary of the calculations for Fringe. We take, as I said before, we take the total Fringe and divide it by productive labor. And then F&A is total of all my indirect costs divided by, and I say COGS, the government uses the term total cost input, and it's total contract cost is how that goes. So let's flip to the next slide and we'll walk through how this works. So you can see here, I gave you an example of their slide from their web page where, and of course I created a very, very short chart of accounts here where everything's in pools, but you would expect within Fringe pools to see things like vacation, PTO, medical, sick, FICA, FUTA, SUTA, things like that would add into this pool of 357,200. Same thing with facilities. You would see rent and repairs and maintenance and utilities. Depending on corporate decisions, there's lots of other things that can go into facilities. Lots of people put their computer expenses in there. They put in office supplies and office furniture and things of that nature. And the reason that we do that with facilities is because in a rate structure where you have like an overhead in G&A, the facilities gets divided based on how much is related to contracts or supports contracts and how much supports corporate activities. So you can split your facilities costs in the Fringe overhead and G&A structure to both sides of the fence based on how the facilities are being used. But in this case, you've got Fringe and then facilities and administration as a thing. So everything below Fringe is all on one side. It's just your indirect rate other than your Fringe rate. So each one of those pools are outlined here and how they fall, what's unallowable, so on and so forth. Now, in the National Institutes for Health, sales and marketing, IRAD are both unallowable, and that's a given, and there is no argument about, oh no, that's not unallowable sales, that's different. For them, they don't have any delineation between different kinds of sales, where you'll find that in the DoD. So anyway, this gives you the structure. If you go to the website, you'll find this structure where, in this left column, the left two columns, basically, you just add enough rows, put in your profit and loss statement, and then you basically sort things over to the columns off to the right, and make sure this all adds up. So so you can see that I've got an error in my first line because the total labor says 515, and then the proof says $1,004,000. So I must have typoed the 515 on the left because the $1,040,071 is the correct number. So, whoops, I didn't realize I could do that. Yeah, so let's flip to the next slide and let's talk about fringe overhead and G&A. And I was looking at the names of the folks that signed up for this, and I think we've got more people probably that are in DoD, NASA, DOE world in this meeting. So we'll spend the rest of our time here, another 10 minutes or so. So fringe here is the same. Take the total of the fringe pool, divide it by productive labor. And then overhead is, is a little bit more complicated. We're going to allocate facilities to overhead. And then we're going to add in our engineering support. And then we're going to add fringe to the engineering support labor. We're going to add our direct labor and our fringe on our direct labor, our bid and proposal labor, our IRAD labor. So all of these things come into, the facilities allocation, engineering support plus fringe. That's going to be the pool that is overhead. And then direct labor, fringe and direct labor, B&P, and IRAD labor is going to be the base of overhead. If you look at the third link at the bottom, bcaconsulting.com, it's one of our competitors, but they have a very, very, very slick way of explaining how this works. So I would urge you to go to that site and look at their presentation. But because overhead is a little more complicated because we're going to bring in B&P labor and IRAD labor, but we're not going to bring in the fringes on those because the fringe on those end up in G&A because, G&A is the total of all the G&A pools, which includes B&P and IRAD. And then we need fringe on all of the labor to make sure fringe is allocated everywhere. And then we're going to take the facilities allocation that belongs to G&A, and then the overhead allocation to B&P and IRAD because they're not counted anywhere else yet. And then we're going to divide that by all of the cost of goods sold, all of our direct costs, plus our fringe on direct labor, and then plus the total of the overhead. And then we're going to subtract out the overhead on B&P and IRAD because we just put it in the pool. So it's a little complicated, and you can kind of get wound around this because it seems like it circles itself a few times. But the secret to how these formulas work out is to make sure that nothing is double counted. So the sites here, the first two sites are basically how to do an ICE model. ICE is the incurred cost electronic. So it's interesting because regardless of what rate structure you choose, you can pull up an ICE and do the setup, explain your rate system in the setup, and then the ICE will be built for you based on the rate structure that you choose. Now, one of the things I don't like about the ICE is because in the setup it goes through and it hides certain rows and hides certain things. I encourage anyone, if once you do the setup, go into each tab that has been built for you and unhide everything. There is, some glitches in a couple of the ICE models that I have seen where some of the hidden rows will actually bring in numbers, and then you'll have duplications or double subtractions. The DCA is really quick at catching that once you submit your ICE, but it's a little egg on your face when they come back and say, hey, your math doesn't add up. So I would expose all my rows in my ICE and make sure that the ones that were hidden don't contain any data. And then if you want to return it back to the hidden cells, that's fine. But you should take a look at that. Once you have an ICE model that matches your rate structure, you don't have to recreate it. You can just copy and paste and then change the year and use it again next year and just keep using that over and over. So I would say once you have an ICE model that's set up for your company, and especially after the DCA has looked at it and they're happy with the math all adds up because they're very good at that. That you just continue to use that same model until there's a reason for you to change your rate structure. So let's take a look at the calculations. Now this one, I put a little bit of extra information. The P&L is a little bit more on the right-hand side, and then how things drag over to the left is, you kind of have to follow things. It zigzags around, but you can see the total of the fringe pool, which is kind of the middle of the P&L on the right-hand side, gets pushed into the fringe pool, so that's 357,250, and then the fringe base is all productive labor, which is $1,040,000, and so the fringe rate here is 34%. Then you have a facilities pool, and what we've done with this organization is we've based facilities on labor. Now you can base facilities on square footage if you can tell what square footage is earmarked for what. I find with a lot of small businesses that people wear many different hats. So you'll have someone who could be your director of operations. He could also be or in doing bid and proposals. They could be on the floor as a technician. They could also be out there as an engineer. So going by labor kind of earmarks your facility space by the labor pools as opposed to by square footage. So you make a decision on how that works. I actually worked in a place that had admin space, and then we had production and labor and R&D space. So doing it by square footage was actually very simple. So however you do that, you should come up with a percentage. In this case, we're doing it by labor, so we divide the 128,500 by the 1,040,000. We come up with a percentage, and then we apply that percentage to the 128,50 to allocate so much to overhead, which eventually gets allocated into your cost of goods, and then allocated to G&A, which is corporate activities. And obviously make sure that those two numbers add back to the 128,500. So if you did it by square footage, you could say, well, 80% of our square footage is overhead, so we're going to multiply 128 by 80, and then 20% of our square footage is there. So, and you would move it in that way. So how you do that doesn't make a difference. You should be consistent, and if you decide to change from one method to the other, you should have a reason because they will ask. So looking at the rest of overhead, we're going to take the engineering support pool, then we're going to take fringe on the overhead labor, and then that facilities allocation that we just calculated, and that's going to give us a new total overhead. And then that total overhead will be divided by the total overhead base that we're calculating the direct labor, fringe on direct labor, bid and proposal, IRAD labor. That gives us a new overhead base. And so our overhead rate here is the 632, 150, 331 divided by 770, 450, 683, or 82.05%. So hopefully you guys aren't asleep yet. But so we'll talk a little bit about G&A. G&A it does the same thing. We're going to take each pool. We're going to add all those pools together. We are going to allocate fringe to the labor that exists in each pool. So in the admin pool, we're going to allocate fringe to admin labor. In the sales and marketing pool, we're going to allocate fringe to the sales and marketing labor. Same thing with bid and proposal. There's a fringe allocation to their labor, and then the fringe allocation to the IRAD labor. And then we will allocate facilities to all G&A, so it's up at the top. And then to bid and proposal and IRAD, we're going to allocate overhead. And the reason we do is because overhead has not been allocated to them anywhere else. So that gives you a total G&A pool of 372,847, and then we have to decide what the base is. Well, G&A is the entire corporation, so the incorporation or the company, the incorporation, the LLC, your G&A costs are going to be based on all of your contract revenues, and revenues in this case being not monies received, but monies actually earned through working. So you're going to use your direct labor, its fringe allocation, its overhead allocation. We're going to take out the overhead and the IRAD, or the overhead on BMP and IRAD, because we put it in the base. Otherwise, we'd just be dividing it by itself. And then we're going to add all of our other direct costs, which are things like materials and travel and subcontractors. And that's going to give us a new base, which is the total cost input, or the cost to create revenue on contracts. Divide those two from each other, and in this case, we have a G&A rate of 25.84. So that's it in a nutshell. That's a real hard and fast topical look at how indirect rates are calculated using those three structures. There is literally an unlimited number of rate structure possibilities when you consider all the different pools and how you could possibly mix and match them. But these are the three most common. So I just wanted to kind of recap what we discussed. We discussed the importance of the chart of accounts and how important it is to be able to put things in pools because of agency requirements. For some agencies won't allow you to have sales and marketing in your allowable, or IRAD in your allowable. I think it's important for you to track bid and proposal, because you need to know what it takes to win. And then things like Fringe, that's a pretty standard chart of accounts item. Then we talked about cost elements and what elements go into building a job cost for a grant or a contract, and why indirect in there is generally more than all the rest of the other ones combined, and why indirect rates are so important. Talked about different rate structures and how we determine what rate structure you're going to get. There should be a lot of open areas on how that's determined within your organization. And then we briefly went through the three most common models of how to calculate. So now we're at that point where we've got questions, and I'm not sure, Jamie, if I can see what the questions are. So if you can spin up anybody who's written anything, and I'll try to go through them.
Yep, I will do that. So everyone feel free to write in any questions into the chat feature, and we'll get to as many as we can.
Yeah, so while we're waiting for potential questions, so FAR Part 31 is the area that describes allowability of costs. It has a large section on unallowable costs. So if you haven't perused through that, it's not written too badly. It's actually fairly easy to follow. If you're a very large organization and you're getting into CAS standards, that's FAR Part 32. So CAS generally is about 15 million per year. So that's a pretty large benchmark to hit. And if you get into CAS standards, there's a suggestion on my part that you find a really good consultant to help you at least build your system and teach you how to do that correctly, because the oversight, if you're in CAS level, is very heavy. Pre-CAS, if you're below $750,000 or $7.5 million a year, you're probably in a low to medium audit probability. Once you get over 7.5 million a year and you start moving up towards 15 million, you're kind of in a pre-CAS standard where they expect you to do things in a CAS thing, but they're not going to audit at that level. But you're going to see the auditor more often. You're going to be in the medium auditability group, and then so when you get into CAS, you're in a high audit group, and you're going to see your auditor probably every other year, if not more. So take a look at those two regulations, because they'll help you answer questions on, what's allowable, what's not allowable, why we have certain pools, so on and so forth.
Okay, Brian, so we have a couple questions that have come through. The first one is there a standard or limit on how high the rates can go?
No, and this is a common question about what is a normal rate, or what's a rate that's too high, what's a rate that's too low. There are some limitations. For example, if your IRAD is too high, the government would come in and cap it. And so if your IRAD is above 15% of your total cost input, and your overall rate is too high, then they're going to cap your IRAD and say you just can't claim any more than that. They can do the same with bid and proposal. They can say we're not going to pay for any more than that. But the onus is really on the organization to try to do your market research and find out what's competitive in your market, and then try to make your business as efficient as possible so that you're in the competitive range. And what that is different in every market.
Okay, we have another question that's, can you please remind me what cost structure the DoD likes to see?
Yeah, well, according to the DoD, the most common cost structure they see is fringe, overhead, and G&A, a 3-rate structure. Okay.
Then we have another question. Do we have to track B&P separately from sales and marketing?
Well, you should. And I'll tell you why. And honestly, within sales and marketing, there are unallowable sales. So this is where I refer you back to FAR Part 31. If you are an organization that has a lot of commercial activities and you end up going to trade shows, and I'm going to use plumbing as an example. Let's say that you do a lot of services contracts and you do a lot of plumbing and even maybe plumbing design for the Department of Defense. But you also go to the annual plumbing trade show in Montreal, Canada. That sales and marketing portion of the Montreal, Canada is unallowable. Bid and proposal now is generally an allowable category because it's time that you spend trying to win contracts and win jobs. So good to separate sales and marketing, because some sales and marketing is unallowable. Bid and proposal generally is always allowable, unless you're in a cap situation. And then within sales and marketing now, you want to make sure that your descriptions, when you put them in your accounting system, are very clear, and that if things need to be moved to unallowable, you should just go ahead and do that before an auditor shows up and says, hey, why is this sitting?
Great. So it looks like that's all the questions we have and about all the time we have right now. So thank you so much, Brian, for presenting the webinar today. So for those of you who have attended, we know you'll probably have questions or might want some clarifications and further information after seeing this webinar. So that's why the SBDC provides one-on-one consulting, which is confidential at no cost to you and available throughout the life of your business. To take the next step, to get more information and schedule an initial consulting appointment, go to sbdc-techsource.org. And just one date to remember is the Innovation and Opportunities Conference, which is happening November 14th through 15th. We hope to see you all there. I will be sending out the slides and a copy of the webinar today so that you can review. And Brian is one of our consultants, so you are welcome to schedule some time one-on-one with him. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.